the programs for SummerFest, for me, always seem to be a giant jigsaw puzzle. It takes a while for the fine details to fill in, although you do start with a general outline, and the inner details start to get filled in as time progresses. There are two premises. One is, I think, diversity. That's my priority. I want to have works that are not only great, but sometimes not necessarily well known, but interesting for the audience to experience, so that you don't want to feed everybody a steady diet of only the great blockbuster pieces. You want to throw things that are fun too. Walton Facade is one such work. At the same time, the other aspect is that SummerFest and its parent company, La Jolla Music Society, are ever more committed to commissioning and bringing new music to the festival. I think the main difference this year is that we put most of the new music or newer works into one particular program. It's not to compartmentalize it, but it might be easier for the audience to choose what they want to hear, rather than people expecting to hear Schubert, but during that concert they may feel force-fed a brand new work. But instead, the people who really think they might enjoy new works, they can just go to that concert. And people who fancy an unusual work like the Walton Facade, they can choose that particular concert. So it's not for particular sort of extra musical reasons. For me, it's a matter of making music seemingly sensible to all the public and to make it easier for them, for our audience to make choices. Number one criteria is that I don't want to play any works that I have already performed at SummerFest past. Number two, I want to play with my favorite colleagues. And what can I do with the particular artists who are already engaged for that particular time period in SummerFest? So for instance, the fabulous clarinetist Bert Hara, he's coming for that opening week, but that's all he can stay. So I wanted to play something with him. And Bartók Contrast is something that doesn't get played very often, and I really thought that I can really have a great deal of fun playing with Bert, and also I can present Bartók Contrast yet again to the audience. And then I found out that Anne-Marie McDermott can come and play as well during that week. So I said, well, how about a sonata that she and I have already played once in New York together, the Ravel Sonata. Can we repeat that 5-6 years later now? But she agreed. So we simply thought that Ravel and Bartók would be a very interesting and nice pairing for part of the concert. And then for about a year now, this English violinist, composer, Julien Milon, has been meaning to write his rendition of Mozart's Magic Flute for 4 violins and bass. And finally, in May, he gave me the score and parts. And so I thought, this is great. We can certainly put the Milon as an opening work. And then Brahms' G Major Sextet is my personal favorite because I think it's one of the most sublime, not only work of Western music, but it's also one of the most, I would say, inward and most intimate work of Brahms. And I always loved it. And I learned the piece with Isaac Stern, who was really my hero. And so it's wonderful for me to be able to program that. And this time I really picked my favorite players to join me. And that's my prerogative as a music director. How to put a work together is really dependent on how open-minded the artists are. I've learned that as I get older, I'm actually more open-minded than before, rather than becoming very locked in on certain interpretive approaches. I'm much more flexible in playing things faster, slower, louder, softer than I used to be when I was in my 20s. In a piece like Brahms' Sextet, you have to imagine 6 players come from very different backgrounds, not only in musical training and thought, but also in their personal experience with that particular sextet. So you may have 6 very different opinions. But this is when a certain friendship can make a big difference. Is that you're willing to make the compromise and willing to listen to what your colleague has to say, maybe a suggestion that may not be to your liking initially, but if you're willing to try, you might find it very appealing, and it might take a day or two for you to digest that particular new approach, and you may reject it in the end. Then you seek a new set of compromises, but it might open up a whole new possibility for your next performance. So the trick in a rehearsal situation is not to get bogged down with 6 people all yelling at each other. That just doesn't help matters at all. But it's to really pinpoint the most, I would say, the most crucial places and fix them. Because often when you're playing, you don't need to stop and discuss or verbalize any differences. Sometimes you have to just listen carefully to what a colleague is doing and react to that, or to do something that will enhance that, or to give that particular interpretation or interpretive approach a equal answer. You know, a lot of chamber music is really give and take, and when in a performance, after it's all said and done, you just let your instincts take over in the performance, and that's when things can become really beautiful for everyone concerned. Because you know, if you click in with all your colleagues, it's really a blissful experience. It's funny, you know, Ravel has many sides to his music. You know, the famous bolero is very lush. At least it grows to be very lush toward the end. Rhapsody Espagnole, atmospheric, gorgeous. Daphnis and Chloe, you know, voluptuous, sensuous, gorgeous music. But then the Sonata for violin and cello, a piece of really severe but immensely inventive music. And the Sonata for violin and piano is perhaps less severe than the violin cello sonata, but it has its edgy moments. And I think Ravel paced the piece from beginning to end, the 3 very distinct movements, beautifully. For me, the first movement is one of those French impressionistic pastel paintings, you know, chalk or with watercolor by Renoir, perhaps. Is very, it's devoid of very lush and primary colors. It's all different shades of very subtle colorings, I would say. And the second movement, he goes red hot, you know, with this blues, this really jazzy moment. He even has the violin playing these wild pizzicatos, I think to emulate the banjo. And then, as if that's not enough, then he finishes the sonata off with this perpetual motion last movement, which the violin just doesn't stop playing fast 16th notes, and it goes all from beginning to end. And it's a very exciting movement, but he clearly wanted to write a crowd-pleasing ending. But at the whole time, his inventiveness is awe-inspiring, because the way he mixes the melodies back and forth, like the way, you know, you hear at the very end of the last movement, you know, the violin is going crazy, playing so fast, and then finally, the opening melody of the very first movement is just a very soft, like a little stream flowing, da di da da di da 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 da. It just flows. Except at the very end, the piano blasts that tune out, bom 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 bom, bing bom bom. The same notes, except belt out like trumpets, like a fanfare at the end. For me, that's a stroke of total genius from Ravel. It's, you know, so I've played this sonata, I don't know how many dozens times over the years, and when I encounter this piece again and again, I can't help but think that it's a great, and it's really a masterwork. Oh, I wish Ravel and Stravinsky were present, for that matter, Brahms, Schubert, you know, if we can bring them back and talk to the audience, it would be thrilling. And not only for me as an audience member, if I'm attending a concert, but also as a performer, because you really want to hear what the composer has to say. And the dialogue between the performer and the composer during the preparation process is very interesting. The dynamic is always different. You know, some composers, for instance, are very deliberate about what they want. They're very precise in their instructions, and they want the performer to really stick to it. And some are very easygoing and looser, perhaps. And some others yet are very prone to thinking on the go. In other words, one night before the premiere, the composer wants to revise certain parts. Once here, I think in one of the telecasts for you several years ago, this Azerbaijani composer, Frangiz Alizadeh, we did this piece with pipa, cello, violin, piano. And after she heard our performance, our rehearsal of it, she wanted to make additional, I don't know how long it was. She gave the piece an additional some 40 bars of music. She wrote it out overnight, and she gave it to us the morning of the premiere. And we had to learn it, of course, very quickly, because she was not satisfied. And Joan Tower likely will make some revisions to this trio La Jolla we just premiered. And I mean, composers do that. And so it's very interesting for me to see how their minds work, if they are really rigid or they are more open-minded. And we can use some of that experience to interpret music from the past. You know, can we imagine, say, how Sibelius, how precise did he want things? And that's why we read contemporary accounts, you know, letters and descriptions from musicians and audience, how Beethoven or how Mozart played their music. And and here we are. We have firsthand experience working with the composer. I think it's fascinating. It's hard to explain, but sometimes a work, whether new or old, is simply thorny to play. It's not user-friendly. And the trick for a composer is to write the most effective music without killing the performers. And that's a very tough task for many composers. And so the trick also is for the performers like me to convey either approval, disapproval, or helpful hints for a composer to make certain notes sound better on the violin, for instance. You know, there are passages written by Joan Tower or Mark Nykruk that might sound very good in their heads, but when it's executed on a violin, it might result in something a little bit harder or edgier than they wanted. So it's my job to present some possible options for them to consider in revising a passage. And sometimes we have to really do that on the fly because we don't have much time before the premiere. So it's a very intense process. For me, the second go around this year is much easier. I've played this piece a lot. I also got to hear Salonen's eventual tone poem, Insomnia, which is based on this piece, Lachen Verlernt. And I really have much stronger idea of what Salonen wants. First time, my task was to play all the right notes, to present a somewhat coherent vision of this piece. But now it's, 5 years later, I've played it so many times that I can step back and look at this piece in totality and then go back in there again without the intimidation factor that, the technical hurdles and whatnot, because I figured them out. Then it's become a part of my system. And so this time around, I feel much more comfortable. I'm feeling like I'm giving the piece an interpretation rather than taking on the piece simply to get it right. It's gone beyond that. So it's more gratifying the second time around here. Walton's Violin Sonata is rarely played. I didn't even know the existence of this work until one day I was at the Juilliard Library looking for the music of Walton's Violin Concerto. And when I pulled the music out of the shelf, the Violin Sonata fell off the shelf, and I picked it up, and I said, "What is this, a sonata by Walton?" So I opened up the page, and I saw this opening melody. I said, "Oh, that looks beautiful." So I took the music out, immediately sought out André Schub to play it with me, although it's a very difficult piece to sight read. So, but we made some outlines of it. We thought this is really worth learning. So we decided to put it into our recital programs. And I've grown to love this piece tremendously. It's beautiful, very romantic, and yet a hint of modernism. You know, it's not the entirely 19th century or Rachmaninoff like romanticism. But it's got hints of, you know, Debussy, a little bit Stravinsky once in a while, even a little Bartók. But it's a very well, I don't know. It's a very unique sonata, and to put it on the same program with another Walton piece, the Facade, of course, it's the contrast. You know, one really serious and compelling sonata versus the very lighthearted, but you know, very clever work. The Facade is. The Facade is really goofy and. But you know, very clever. I mean, you know, it's probably one of the earliest rap music that you can find. You know, it's in a way Gilbert Sullivan, you know, like, and yet it's. I just find it very clever. I mean, the trick in presenting the piece in the public performance is to have the audience be able to hear as much of the poems as possible, so that you get the witty. All the witty. I mean, it's hard because when you read it, then you start to get all the double entendre and all the funny rhymes that you'll get. But sometimes with music, it's a little hard to decipher. But you know, if you also hear the music alone, and there's an instrumental suite of Facade, no narration, and that's when you realize the music is very cleverly written too. Well, the instrumentation is very interesting. That it's very sparse, and maybe that's why it reminds one of l'histoire, you know, the trumpet and a flute maybe substituting for l'histoire's violin. I think Walton had to be very careful in the instrumentation not to drown out the human voice. And so I think he wrote very sparingly for the ensemble. So you have, you know, a piece that most people may not have heard in Walton Facade or the Violin Sonata. And then, you know, a few days later or earlier, they could have heard Schubert's Trout Quintet, and then a couple days later, a late Beethoven quartet. So you have something that's always different, and so you don't go to the concert time after time and just hear very similar stuff. Elgar is an interesting case for performers. I sense that musicians either hate it or love it. People who are perhaps keen about Stravinsky or Ravel probably will end up disliking Elgar because it's kind of the antithesis of the modern or the earlier 20th century school, and that his music really is so nostalgic, very Victorian, but I love it because maybe I'm sentimental, and the music can be very sentimental, but there is so much grandeur, and yet there's tenderness, a lot of love and passion all in there. It's not a stiff upper lip type of, you know, posture you expect from a typical Brit. But at the same time, you can tell there's a certain regal and very aristocratic quality about his music. And you may say that it's stuffy music, sure, because it's not avant-garde. It's not at all in the forefront of musical styles. It's very retro. But if you can take all that into consideration, yet not think about it, and let the music come to you, Elgar, for me, is beautiful. And that's the other thing about Elgar's music. I think in the case of this piano quintet, it's not the type of music that will reach out and grab you. You know, it's not the Schubert Death and Maiden Quartet or the Brahms Piano Quintet that will instantly get your attention. But it comes to you more gradually and perhaps slowly. And if you allow the music to envelop you and not expect to hear you know, a memorable tune immediately, it's beautiful because the music will envelop you and you feel like there's a beautiful, you're like sitting in a very plush sofa and you're just there, you know. You're not gonna be feeling like you're sitting in the greatest sports car and it's gonna, you know, tear the road up. No, Elgar's music doesn't do that for you, but instead it's like a beautiful carriage ride through some of the most beautiful English countryside. That's the image I always have. You know, Elgar lived in Malvern, the rolling hills, the green pasture, and Elgar saw that. And in a way, that tranquility, it's, you know, permeates his music. That's the other quality about Elgar's music. It's very spacious. You know, if you want dense music, you know, you can look for it in Bartók or even Stravinsky, but not Elgar. I don't think it's ever easy to promote new music. Yet one must try. You know, I mean, music history is littered with failures upon the premieres and the early goings, and only to have the same works gain, you know, incredible popular status. It's very funny. It depends on the point of view. You know, I mean, we take, for instance, music critics' views. You know, a local San Diego critic thought that our modern music concert was sparsely attended, and yet the Los Angeles Times critic thought it was wonderful that the house looked so full. So who's right, who's wrong? I don't know, but it's all a different point of view. And some people think that the fact that we even have an audience there, it's great. But some people might say, well, new music, we should have many more people there because it's so interesting. I cannot make such judgments. But all I know is that Mark Nykruk, of all people, was very happily surprised that the concert was so well attended. I don't know the physics of, you know, making a sound or making a good sound, musical sound, but I know the thinking behind an interpretation or a creation in music. I think it's very similar to what a mathematician will try to create in equations and in formulas, because I've often read, you know, how mathematicians look at something and say, isn't that a beautiful equation? The same, probably similar way, musicians will hear a phrase and say, "Whoa, what a beautiful tune," and also in interpretation, I think like mathematics, we all need a very strong sense of logic. You know, why do we treat phrase A in such a way? It's because phrase B is doing something else, so phrase A has to be such a way in order to make sense with phrase B. And then if you look even further down the road, a few bars later, what does phrase C do that might influence phrase B and A? So in that sense, that we are always looking, you know, ahead and looking back in making sense out of the whole thing. And I believe that is inherently very similar to what, you know, physicists or mathematicians think. And I personally know so many, you know, physicists who love music. And of course, the most famous of them all is Einstein, who played the violin. So I think there is a connection.